Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'm Leslie Octon, one of the Wisdom Ways team staff, and I'm so honored and happy to be able to introduce Ansay Dr. Tamara Gray. It's hard for me not to call her Ansay, and Ansay means teacher. Um, in Syria, they use the word Ansay for teacher, so she is my teacher, my mentor, my spiritual guide, director, all any name you want to use. I use Ansay. So I'm very, very pleased she's here with us tonight. Dr. Tamara Gray is a founder of Rabata, an organization dedicated to promoting positive cultural change through creative educational experiences. She holds a doctorate in leadership from the University of St. Thomas, a master's degree in curriculum theory and instruction from Temple University, and spent 20 years studying traditional and classical Islamic sciences, Quran, and Arabic in Damascus, Syria. Dr. Gray worked in the field of education for 25 years before moving into the nonprofit world. She is now both the executive director of Rabata and its chief spirituality officer. Her work includes the daily nitty-gritty of project design, as well as the support and mentorship of hundreds of women around the world. She is the instructor for more than 10 subjects at Rabata, teaches Rabatines, and contributes to curriculum development. Dr. Gray is also an author and translator. Her publications range from several culturally appropriate English language curriculum programs to translations of sacred text. She has authored 2 books, Joy Jot's Exercises for a Happy Heart and Project Lena, Bringing Our Whole Selves to Islam, and co-translated a compendium of the collection of sources on Sirah an-Nabawiyya. In addition to her work at Rabata, Dr. Gray is also on the Collegeville Institute's Interreligious Fellows Program, working to develop educational programming for faith leaders around social justice issues. She also serves as both faculty and an academic council member for the Islamic Seminary of America, teaches at the United Theological Seminary of the Twin Cities, and is a senior fellow at the Yaqeen Institute. She has recently joined the Fiqh Council of North America in addition to her other responsibilities. Dr. Tamara is a mother of 3, grandmother of 2, an avid reader, and a lover of cultures, people, coffee, and food. And that's why we get along so well, for many other reasons. And so we're very happy to have Ansay is going to talk. And as she's talking, if you have any questions, go ahead and pop them into the chat. And we'll try to, she'll either see those questions and answer or say, I'll get to it a little bit later, or definitely leave time at the end to go through those questions. So welcome, Ansay.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. Only thing that could make it better is if we were all together in one big room. But I have a feeling quite a few of you might not be able to make it if that were the case. So I'll just be really happy that we get to be together here in this digital space. So today it's my job to, in a short time, try to present this idea of Islam and women, women and Islam, Muslim women. And so I've put together a little presentation. And as Leslie said, I will be sort of keeping my eye on the chat box as much as possible. If I use Arabic terms without translating them, you can call me out and say, what was that word you just used? But I will try not to do that. And I will try to be super clear. Yeah, so if you have questions in the midst, just throw them in the chat. And if I know I'm already going to reach that later, I will not answer it. I'll just wait until I get there. All right, so here is my presentation. So this is a picture of me. As you can see, you know me, and some lovely women. We were in Malaysia, actually, when we took this picture. And since my talk is called Women in Islam, I thought you should see some Muslim women. You know me. The woman in purple is both a professor in the medical school, as well as a philanthropist in Malaysia and Cambodia. She's opened a clinic in Cambodia and a school in Malaysia. The one next to her is a cardiologist, and she opened a chapter of my nonprofit there in Malaysia. Next to her, sort of in the back, is Sarah Abe, who has an incredible history with our organization here in Minnesota. She comes from Michigan, and was instrumental in us getting started here in Minnesota. But she came with us to Malaysia, so she lives here, not in Malaysia. Just that's it. And then the other person next to her is PhD and MD in medicine, the lady in the white scarf with the flowers around her neck. She's from the UK. She also came to Malaysia with us, also a medical doctor. And next to her, you can barely see her, is someone from Michigan, actually, one of our board members, who is the head of a $5 million nonprofit in Flint, Michigan. So I just thought it was important to share all of these women, because very often Muslim women get this sort of rap that we are, I don't know, not accomplished. And I want you to know that Muslim women are all different kinds of women, just like every other woman. And I also am going to try a little trick here where I click on the link to say that we're going to use hello to help you remember what we're talking about today. Okay, so hello is our acronym. We're going to cover 5 ideas around women in Islam. Hallowed tradition. So what is our sacred tradition around Muslim women? We're going to get into a little bit of theology there. Empowering systems. What are some of the financial and legal systems that we have? Some lived literacies, some legal discussion, and we're going to talk about some of the obstacles that we do face uniquely as Muslim women, and what different women are doing to overcome those obstacles. That is a huge hope to cover all of this. So I do want to say, while I will do my darndest to cover it all, none of it will be covered in depth, and everything we cover could be talked about for a very long time on its own. So think of this as your ice cream shop, where you're getting a little tiny spoonful of all of the flavors, and one day later we can have a double scoop of any one flavor. Okay, that's how we're going to think about it. So first of all, just to talk a little bit about hallowed tradition, I've got a little picture there of a scaffolding, because I'm trying to build for you a scaffold. So for Muslim women, the sacred tradition is based on 2 sacred texts. One is the Quran, I'm sure you've heard of it, and the other is what we call the Sunnah, or we call it the Hadith. That's the words and actions of the Prophet of Islam. So I have a verse here in Arabic. فاستجاب لهم ربهم أني لا أضيع عمل عامل منكم من ذكر أو أنثى بعضكم من بعض. I apologize for the Arabic, but I'm sharing with you in Arabic for a reason. For Muslim women, only the Arabic Quran is the Quran. Any translation is an interpretation, and it's helpful, but it's not considered the Quran on its own. This particular verse says, and their Lord responded to them, naught is the work of any of you lost, be he male or be the one male, be you male or female, you are one of another. So this verse, and then the verse on the next page, which is also in Arabic, but you can look at it because it's pretty, is another verse that speaks to the theological concept of men and women in Islam, or women, if you will, since that's our topic today. This verse is a long one. I won't read the whole thing in Arabic, but it is the Muslim men and the Muslim women, the believing men and the believing women, the worshipful men, the worshipful women, the truthful men, the truthful women, the patient men, the patient women, etc. God has for them forgiveness and great reward. These 2 verses, along with others, lay the theological foundation of the concept of are women and men on equal footing in Islamic theology? And the answer is yes. Men and women are on equal theological footing in Islamic theology. That's not the same as every Islamic society, but it is theologically that men and women both stand before God with their deeds and their worship as independent individual people. I was recently in a talk with a professor from Cambridge. The talk was in Cambridge, but it was in Chicago, but it was Zoom. One thing he said that I thought was important, so I'll mention it here, is that a lot of times people try to say that men and women complement each other. And that's not really an Islamic thought. Islamic thought is that men and women are both independent individuals. They don't complement one another as though one has less and another has less of something, and they need those things. But rather, men and women are independent individuals theologically in this faith. Okay, so that moves us into this historical. So I'm still in this idea of a sacred tradition. What's our tradition? What do we look at? I'm going to fly through 15 slides now, so forgive me for that. But just, it's not meant to be a history lesson. Just remember the little tastes of ice cream, okay? This is actually not even a whole spoon, because I really think that when we're talking about a sacred tradition, it's always important to look back and see who are the mentors, who are the people that we're looking up to. I've skipped the first generation, the earliest generation, which is the generation of Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. So what I've done is skip that generation and go to other generations just to introduce you to some women. Now, those years are the Hijri years. So those are the centuries after the death of the Prophet of Islam. And we are now in the 15th century. So I'm basically going to show you 14 pictures. This one is a woman named Amra bint Abdurrahman. She was a jurist, and her opinions were very important and taken above some of the male important jurists of the time. Nafisa al-Tahira was a woman who, even to today, her scholarship and piety was so well known that people still visit her grave today to remember her. And she was a teacher of some of our most important early scholars. I don't know if you've ever heard of al-Qarawiyyin, or Qarawiyun, maybe it's called in English. The university in Morocco that is the oldest still living university. It was built and started by Fatima al-Fihri, who is represented here. Maryam al-Jalliya al-Istirabiyya, you can see she's holding an astrolabe in her hand. This is 4th century. She was a very important engineer and scientist who worked in astrolabes, making them more and more precise, and she was hired and paid for her work by the governor of that time. Karima bint Ahmed al-Marwaziya is I like her because of her, she was very famously very strict, what we might call a very strict professor, where if anybody wanted to get her ijaza, so that word ijaza, a man named George Maqdisi, I don't know if you're interested in further studies on your own, but a man named George Maqdisi out of the University of Pennsylvania wrote a book in the 80s called The Rise of Colleges. And that book traces the development of the bachelor's, master's, and PhD degrees to the ijaza system amongst Muslims. So it's an interesting book to read if you're interested in that kind of stuff. But her ijaza, or degree, was very difficult to get. She was like the Harvard degree of hadith studies, hadith being the words of the Prophet ﷺ. Fatima bin Sa'd al-Khair is another person who traveled a lot for knowledge. She traveled from where she was born in China, all across Cairo, Damascus, and different places to learn different topics. Razia Sultan was a political leader. She became the political leader because her father decided that she had more piety and wisdom than her brothers. And so she was the inherited political leader, the second leader of the Delhi Sultanate, which is over in the Indian subcontinent today. Al-Adar al-Karima was in Yemen, and she was queen or leader of Yemen for 14 months and famous for the peace that she brought, but also the philanthropic work that she did. Bibi Raji back in India was sort of like almost a very rich philanthropist today, who was very interested in social change, and she would fund scholars and projects in order to create that social change that was important to her. So she was like a foundation in and of herself. Queen Aminatu was a fascinating woman. There's actually a movie made out of her life now. I haven't seen it. And I don't know that the history of it is what I read of her life. But nonetheless, she was a very important military leader, known to be a fierce warrior. And she was one who developed clay fortress walls, which is very cool as well. Mumtaz Mahal, Taj Mahal. I'm sure you've heard of the Taj Mahal. This was a building that built because of this woman here. She was very, very religious woman. It said that she taught her husband about the night prayers. She had 14 children and died in giving birth to the 14th, and her husband was in so much grief he built the Taj Mahal in her memory. But she was also a very, very important woman in her line of spirituality. And her daughter actually, which I don't have a poster of her, but her daughter actually became the ipso facto leader because their father was just building the Taj Mahal. Asma Ibrit was a calligraphist and artist, and her work is still found in Turkey. And Nana Isma'u, someone very close to my heart, I could do a whole 2 hours just on her, was a scholar, poet, and activist in West Africa, and developed a whole new pedagogical method, really, along with a curriculum program in order to educate women and children out in the villages and the lands that the covered, which is pretty much Nigeria of today. Amina Silmi is an interesting person. She lived in the United States. She was born in 1977, and she was one of the people working with the National Organization of Women who worked to establish rape as a war crime. Believe it or not, before her work, it was not a war crime, and that was because of the Bosnian War at the time, where rape was one of the weapons of the Serbs, and she was one of the people to make sure that it became a war crime. And I will say also, in spirit of Islamophobia, after she had worked so hard to make this happen, when they got the award for it, they asked her not, the National Organization of Women asked her not to come on stage because of the way she dressed, which is, it's just horrifying. She was a fighter, and she argued with them up and down and pointed out to them the great bigotry that they were saying, until they agreed, and she was able to stand on the stage with them. She also is the instigator of the Forever stamp, that Eid stamp. Okay, I think that's the end of my history. Yeah, so that's just an introduction to a whole bunch of women. Islam as a religion is also a system of law and politics, finances, education. It has advice and structure for family life, social life, and all sorts of things. And so the financial system is one that, for women, because my talk here is about women, insists on the right of women to independent financial resources. An example of that is that when a woman and a man get married, and this is from 1400 years ago, that when they get married, a woman's property remains her property. It doesn't pass off into her husband. There isn't any expectation. Now, in some Muslim families today who live in the West, this isn't like this. But traditionally, there wasn't an expectation that she would share her money or give her money to her husband. Rather, her money is her money, belongs to her. Anything that she shares with the family is charity for her. Whereas in the structure for men, it's a responsibility for them to care for the family, not only their nuclear family, but also the more extended family, financially and materially. The Islamic system of education not only allows for the right to educational opportunity, but both secular and sacred educational opportunities. So one difference between Muslim and other peoples of other faiths in the structure of religious leadership, for example, is that traditionally Muslim religious leadership was based in scholarship. And that scholarship was accessible to men and women. Now, there are some exceptions to that in the past couple hundred years, especially during colonialism. But traditionally, the accessibility was important, and we see it and saw it historically in women scholars, in women that became scholars of religion and faith. There's a brand new encyclopedia, 43 volumes of just names and biographies of women scholars over the centuries. It has 12,000 names in it. These names and this sort of evidence that historically we had a lot of women that took advantage of the system of educational opportunity. And domestic systems, the Muslim family worldwide has been affected by, I would say, sort of the global June, what's her name? Cleaver, June Cleaver, is it June? The global June Cleaver thing. That traditionally, that wasn't the case. The domestic life originally in the system or the historic demonstration of domestic life was really a life around helping, where every member of the family worked in the house and worked to make the house a place of happy domesticity, if you will. Where people, I mean, we have a number of stories of the Prophet, for example, or male companions who washed their clothes, made the bread, sewed their clothes, all these kinds of things that modern society has sort of labeled as woman's work. We're getting away from that a little bit now, but the Muslim communities around the world are very much affected by global culture and definitely do have a much more Western view now of nuclear families that didn't exist 300, 400, 500 years ago, before colonialism, etc. The political system, Islamic political system, women have always had a right to political agency. The first caliph that was voted for in the way we understand voting was somebody named Ali. And when that vote happened, men and women voted. So the concept of voting for men and women, it was never an idea that only men could vote or only women could vote. That would be kind of a fun history to have, but we don't have it. So, and political agency also around leadership. I showed you Razia Sultan, who was a leader in India. Nana Asma, who was part of the leadership in West Africa. She wasn't the actual sultan, but she had a lot of leadership. And many other different women who carried political power and political authority. We have this, and even in modern days, we have Benazir Bhutto and people like this. Like, women have carried political leadership. And there have been people against them, but against their politics, not against their gender. Okay. Social system is also really important because life for women has changed a lot in the past, 150 years maybe? And it's really interesting because as I look from a sociological lens to women's lives across geographical and historical borders, I see that women have moved from very private lives to much more public participation, if we're looking at middle class and above. And interestingly, from the earliest days, there was always an emphasis on both a right to private life, but also a right and a responsibility to public participation. So these are some of the basic concepts of the systems. So now here we are at lived literacies. To me, what that means is, what does it mean to live as a Muslim woman? To live as a Muslim woman, it's actually really critical to have religious literacy. This is different than my personal experience as a Lutheran when I was young, and I know that that's anecdotal, but and it's different, I think, than the experiences of many women in different faiths around the world. What I mean by religious literacy here is that because the faith of Islam includes systems and laws around politics and economics and money and finance, it's really critical for women to have religious literacy, or very easily their rights can be taken away from them. And we've seen this happen many times, whether in the home or in community or in whole countries. And it's been the first thing to be taken away. When colonialists first went to Muslim countries, the first thing that they did was strip the possibility for religious literacy for men and women. But from women especially, it was very dangerous, because when women didn't have religious literacy, of course, that affected families and children. Financial literacy and general literacy, I mention them here because these are things that are really important and things that are considered part and parcel of what it means to be a believing woman. Because in Islamic thinking, there are two aspects of being a believer. To be a believer and a person who does good deeds. Okay? Now, those good deeds, in English, good deeds sounds like, I'm going to do a good deed and now I'm not. I'm going to do a good deed and now I'm not. But actually in Arabic, what it means is like living a life of goodness, So everything I do is towards goodness. So there are categories of good deeds, and one of the greatest is charity. And you saw Fatima al-Fihri and that university, that was built out of her charity. Like, she inherited money from her father after her father died. And she and her sister, actually, they both built mosques and schools. But it's Fatima's that became famous. Her sister's is less famous, though it's still standing today. And so that financial literacy is really very important and has always been something important. And then general literacy, Islamic thinking around education never separated between the secular and the sacred. The secular was sacred because it was important to know math and science, I don't know, cooking, military strategy, farming, how to go on a ship. I mean, how to build a ship. All of these kinds of engineering. All of these things are important for us to live our lives. Humanities, sociology. They're important to live our lives. And because our life is connected to being a believer, all sciences become sacred. And so the emphasis of education historically has been a very strong emphasis in general. For women, it's been in the middle and upper classes. It has also been emphasized in the lower classes as women across the world. Whenever there's poverty, there's a lack of education. But there is a myth and rumor that Muslim women inherit half of what men inherit. I don't know if you've heard that before, but it is a myth out there. And the actual fact of inheritance in Islam is that it is specified. As a Muslim, you can't divide up your inheritance however you want. Like, let's say you have $100,000 to give away, okay, after you die. When you're alive, you can give it to whoever you want. Do whatever you want with it. And in fact, when you're alive, if you're going to give it to your children, you have to be fair and give. If you're giving 10,000 to your son, you have to give 10,000 to your daughter. It's okay to make those equatable in what is important to them. In life, children need to receive equal gifts if you want to be of those who follow the rulings. Not everybody does, but if you want to be, they have to be fair. But after death, money has to be divided in very specific ways. It's a very complicated mathematical problem, as a matter of fact. The simple math, if you have $90,000 you're leaving behind, 1/3 of that, so $30,000, you can write in a will to give to anyone you want. You can donate it to Rabata and to wherever you want to give it. But the 60,000, the 2/3 of your money, must be divided according to Islamic law. Now, it's a complicated mathematical structure. Sometimes in a family, a man might get double what a woman gets. Sometimes a man and a woman will get the same, and sometimes a woman will get more than a man. It depends on where they are in the family and in the family structure. So it's much more complicated than just a man gets double what a woman gets, which is what that's a great fun thing to say on Fox News. But like the rest of the things they say on Fox News, it's just not true. It's a simplification of a complicated science. I'll go to the women in polygamy because that's my picture there, supposedly. Okay. So you've got this, Arab man with a dagger in his belt, and he's got these 3 women around him, this whole idea of women in polygamy. I don't know if that's the image people have. I want to say 3 things about women in polygamy. First of all, I want to change a word. So I'm sure you've all heard the word harem. Have you ever heard the word harem before? Okay, I'm going to ruin your trivia pursuit question. Harem, there were people who went to visit the Ottomans in the early ages of the Ottomans, and these men who went to visit, they weren't allowed into what they called the harem. In Arabic, it's the haram, okay? But you don't care about the Arabic. So they weren't allowed in the harem. So they came back and they said, ooh, this is a sexual den. Ooh, this is something where women are sitting and waiting for men to come to them. This was literally the European sexual fantasy, okay? It was not true. The harem, and actually we have a woman anthropologist from Europe who also traveled Turkey to the Ottoman Empire. Not Turkey, it wasn't Turkey then. And because she was a woman, she was let in. So she wrote about these harems. Laundry, children, women hanging around together in different states of undress, because they didn't expect to have non-family males enter into this space. And as you can see, if you look at me, a lot of Muslim women wear a hijab, which if I was in that space called the harem, I wouldn't be wearing. So I wouldn't want strange men to come in unless they let me know and take my permission first. So the harem was a space and a place of laundry and kids and women and friends too. I mean, it wasn't just like that kind of thing, but it was a place of women hanging out together, talking, family members, women coming in and out, and this and that. Okay, so now that, I hope I've put that aside. Now, polygamy in Islam, it is not forbidden. I guess that's the way to say that. Polygamy meaning can a man marry more than one wife in the Islamic law? First of all, just to set your hearts at ease, if they live in America, they should be following the laws of America. And if they're not, then they have to stand before God on that. But like literally Islamic law says you should follow the law of the place that you live in. However, I want to talk about this concept of polygamy because as an American woman, I find it really strange and really like, seriously, that's not good. Who wants to do that? But I'm older now, and I've visited many places, and I went to Qatar once, and I was a consultant at a school where a principal, she was so passionate about education, and I really became friends with her because we had that same sort of passion. Anyway, so we went out to dinner, and at dinner, she told me that her husband had a second wife, and I was like, oh, and she's like, what are you talking about? I told him, please go get married to somebody else. I do not have time for you. You are in my face all the time. I do not need more in my life than 50% of a man. Now, that is an attitude that is very outside of Western culture. I want to say that. I understand that. For most of us, it feels like betrayal. Now, I want to say that in Islamic law, you don't have to be part of a polygamous marriage if you don't want to. But it is available if somebody wants to be. And it is part of Islamic law, yes. Now, the Quran itself allows for a man to marry up to 4 wives, but says in the Quran itself, says only if you can treat them fairly, but you'll never be able to treat them fairly, and therefore it is better to be married to only one. I always read that and thought, that's it then. There should never be a polygamous marriage. Until I met my friend from Qatar. And after her and a few other women that I've met that have really preferred the polygamous lifestyle, I've just been like, all right, it's not maybe something that I would love, but it's okay if somebody else thinks that this is their bee's knees. It's all right. They can be their bee's knees if they want it to be their bee's knees. However, the concept of it being something that is oppressive is against Islamic thought, because dhulam, or oppression in Islam, is one of the greatest sins. The last picture down there, and I'll talk about hijab. I said the word hijab already. That's the scarf I have on my head. Hello. I'm wearing navy blue because, well, it's a long story. I lived in Syria for a long time. I have a nostalgic connection to navy blue. I know it looks like black to you. Trust me, it's navy blue. Here, she's wearing pink to prove that we don't have to wear black or navy blue. Pink. There you go. The definition of hijab is that which is modest clothing and includes the covering of the hair. It is something that is a requirement for those who want to follow the Islamic law. Does every Muslim woman do it? No. As you very well know. I'm sure you know plenty of Muslim women that don't. Is it a private law or a public law? This is a really important one because Saudi Arabia, I will control my tongue. Saudi Arabia, of course, has made terrible laws, many of them, and they've made public the controlling of women. And Saudi Arabia likes to pretend that they are somehow the example of Islamic law. I would like to say unequivocally that they are not. Hijab is a private law. So what that means is that it's something that a woman does out of piety and desire for closeness to God and a desire to fulfill that requirement. It's not something that a government should impose upon her. The picture down below of the woman in the burqa, that's a burqa Afghani, I believe. This to Western women looks very oppressive because it looks hard to move in, and the whole covering the face thing. As you can see, I don't cover my face. I used to look at clothing like that too and be like, how can anybody move in that? Until I met somebody wiser than I, who pointed out to me that when you grow up with a certain way of dressing, then you learn how to wear those clothes with all comfort and without any sort of being held back. The cultures that wear them and love them and have all the different embroidered colors and have all this stuff, that's awesome. Again, the Taliban in Afghanistan try to force women to dress in a certain way. This is patriarchy, masculine steroid problems, where the government decides that what they're going to do is going to change the problems in their countries to control women. I just don't know what to say. I mean, but I am innocent, and Islam is innocent of their behavior. I want to say something about women in hope and women in change, but especially in Muslim societies. The problems and difficulties and obstacles that are in the pathway of Muslim women are numerous. From Islamophobia, internalized Islamophobia, refugee status, political problems, post-colonial stress disorder. I think I made that up, but maybe somebody else said it before me. And other serious political and social problems, as well as great poverty. Muslim women should be really in a terrible place. But the reality is that Muslim women are actually across the world really doing well, educationally, in politics, socially, except for when there is great poverty, just like everywhere else. When there is great poverty, we find terrible oppression. And sometimes that oppression comes from the laws in the country that are claimed to be careful, here comes a scary word. If hold on to your seats, hold on to the table. It's a scary word. Sharia. Sharia law, some countries call Sharia law anything that oppresses a woman, they call that Sharia law. Again, I would say that Islam is innocent of such a thing. Sharia is just a word that means a group of laws. It's like constitutional law. In fact, I teach a class that compares constitutional law and the three sort of theories of looking at constitutional law with some very similar traditions and ways of looking at Sharia or Islamic law. What are some obstacles that Muslim women are dealing with worldwide? We do have cultural mindsets that are a struggle. We have some Bedouin mindsets. We have some June Cleaver mindsets. We have some post-colonial stress disorder mindsets. And there's a book, Pierre Bourdieu wrote this as an ethnography, as he literally watched the Algerians intentionally tear down the very fabric of Algerian society. And it gives you an idea about what some of the obstacles that women in these countries that are now in post-colonial dictatorships are dealing with. And they're serious problems. Islam is not at fault, but Islam sometimes is used as a weapon against these women in order to control them for one reason or another. Poverty and war are very serious issues. And unfortunately, like there are some hot spots where war just doesn't seem to leave. Oftentimes, religion is blamed for these wars. I would tell you to look under the earth and find the oil instead, or water. Sometimes it's about water and the disagreements about who is going to keep this river and who is going to keep this water and who isn't. A lot of times it's about borders that were drawn by foreigners or just local power. Sectarianism is another obstacle that women are dealing with today. Not so much. Muslim women are getting away from some of the literalist movements of the 90s and the early 21st century. That's a helpful thing for women. And ignorance, terrible lack of religious literacy, especially amongst Muslims. Some strategies to combat these obstacles include women's organizations. In Minnesota, we have Rabata, which we have a cultural center over here in Arden Hills. We do curriculum, we do teaching, we do all sorts of religious literacy, general literacy, and financial literacy. There are also numerous other women-run Muslim organizations here in the Twin Cities. amazing organizations run by women. Oh, there's at least 12. Another strategy is to cooperate between different groups and organizations. That's something that is working really well. Of course, political pressure helps, and there are some organizations that do a good job of putting political pressure on some of the Middle Eastern governments. In Malaysia is a country that is a nice place to look for a more advanced sort of way of managing, as a Muslim majority country, and women in that country and the political pressures that happen there. Economic protection, educational programming is really important for women around the world. A real quick list: a woman's property cannot be seized by her husband. That might seem like a no-brainer to you, but up into the 80s, even women in the West couldn't open a checking account without her husband's permission. A woman cannot be denied her right to an education. Forced marriage is absolutely prohibited. Women can and should vote. Women can provide sole testimony. Women can initiate divorce. They have a right to enter into contracts. I know a lot of this stuff might sound sort of like duh, but and sometimes they need to be mentioned. Spousal abuse, or otherwise known as domestic violence, is a punishable offense, and we have plenty of court cases where a woman, if she was hit by her husband, would take him to court. Equal pay for equal work is something that was part and parcel of our this is something that has always stood as part of Islamic foundations of thinking, at least. And women can stand for civil office. I'm almost done. Oh, I'm actually done. Yay me.